Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Teaching in Our Time, an online professional development seminar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd like to take a minute just to introduce you to the National Humanities Center. We are located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina, and we are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. What that means exactly is that we're independent, we're a private nonprofit organization, we're an institute for advanced study, which means that the main program we offer here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center, usually for an academic year, to research and write on topics in the humanities: history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We opened in 1978, and since then about 1,300 scholars have worked here, and as a result of research done here, about 1,300 books have been published. Now, the place may sound like an ivory tower, and it certainly looks like one, but it's not an ivory tower. The founders wanted it to connect with a wide variety of audiences. They were particularly interested in connecting with teachers, and we do that in a number of ways, and you can find out all about the resources and programs we offer for teachers by going to americainclass.org. That will take you to this page, and from this page you can gain access to all of the programs and resources offered by the National Humanities Center for teachers. Now, let me remind you that at the end of our seminar tonight, you can go to the Teaching in Our Time website, and there you will find a recording of this seminar along with a PowerPoint presentation. You will also find, and feel free, by the way, to plunder that PowerPoint presentation and use it in your classes. That's what it's there for. You will also find an evaluation on the website, and we ask you to fill that out and submit it to us online. Those of you who have been with us before will be happy to know that we have shortened that evaluation form considerably. It will take you just a few minutes to fill it out, and we do pay attention to them. They're very important to us. So you'll find a revised, highly shortened evaluation form there now. Once we receive that brief evaluation form from you, we will send you a letter that you'll be able to present to your local certifying authority to get whatever recertification credit your participation in the program tonight warrants. Now, we have two sets of goals, actually. One set is a kind of instrumental set of goals. This has to do with the Common Core state standards. Many of you are teaching under these standards now, and what we're trying to do with our seminars is align our seminars to the standards by looking at strategies to promote close, attentive reading. And as you know, the Common Core standards has as one of their goals to help ensure that all students are college and career ready in literacy, and they hope to promote that through close reading. And so in our seminars, we are going to try to help you develop strategies, show you strategies that will enable you to teach challenging texts through close reading. Now, how will the seminar work? Well, our professor, Sean McCann, will be lecturing on Hemingway's In Our Time. We'll be stopping from time to time to ask discussion questions, and we hope that you will respond to those questions, and we hope you'll also pose your own questions and make comments. And the way you do that is to put your cursor in the green box that I have bracketed there, type your message, and then hit the send button to your right. Your message will appear in the larger box above. I will be following the chat all evening and bringing it into the conversation at appropriate moments. The seminars really work best when you participate, and I'm looking forward to all of your comments and questions this evening. Now, I mentioned that we have two sets of goals. One set is the instrumental goals. Now, these are our intellectual goals for tonight. We hope to identify ways that Hemingway made use of avant-garde techniques in expression and representation and employed them to forge a powerful and enduring vision of modern war and modern life. We also hope to hone awareness of the methods of implication and juxtaposition crucial to Hemingway's artistry. Now, here is our takeaway for this evening. This is what we hope you'll take from the seminar back to your classes. In our time, Hemingway brought the expressive techniques nurtured in the avant-garde world of little magazines to broad popular awareness. In Our Time makes a powerful contribution to the modern understanding of war. And finally, In Our Time is a Cubist novel, an interesting term, that implicitly tells a prodigal son story, as so much American writing of the 1920s does. Boy grows up in a declining world of patriarchal authority, comes to adulthood in an encounter with the brutality and emptiness of war and the degradation of modern commercial society, returns home to an ascetic retreat into the deep, primitive heart of his country. The marvel is that the narrative and expressive technique that accomplishes two things reveals this implicit story not only in the implication created by juxtaposition of fragments and styles, and forges a literary style that feels consistent with the aesthetic discipline modeled by its protagonist. It's got a lot of ground to cover tonight, and during that time we hope to address the questions that you raised in the forum. How does In Our Time relate to modernism? What role do the chapter breaks play in Our Time? How was In Our Time received when it was published? How can we prevent students from making a one-to-one correspondence between Nick Adams and Ernest Hemingway? And finally, how can we get beyond seeing Hemingway as little more than a misogynistic alcoholic who liked nature because it didn't talk back to him? To help us thread our way through In Our Time and through those questions, particularly the last one, we have with us Sean McCann. We're very pleased to have Sean with us. Sean is a professor of English at Wesleyan University. In 2001-2, he was a fellow here at the National Humanities Center. He has written widely on 20th century literature. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn the program over to Sean, who will tell us how we might read In Our Time, In Our Time. Sean, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everybody for being here to talk about Hemingway and his first important book with me. Let me just say that I'm very grateful to be here, although I've never done anything like this before, and it feels kind of strange to be speaking out and to avoid and not to be able to see your faces or to actually hear your comments. But I know that you will be making comments during the course of this discussion, and Richard's going to be monitoring them closely. And let me just say in advance that I hope that you will be asking questions, making comments, interrupting in any way possible as we go along to direct the conversation in the way that seems most useful to you. I'll want to talk about what seems important about the book to me and the ways that you can teach it to students. But if we need to go in other directions, that seems great to me. So before we go on, let me just say that I teach here at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And I teach all levels of college students, and I frequently talk about Hemingway and In Our Time with first and second year college students. So I'm dealing, I think, quite frequently with the kinds of students that you may have passed on to us, and so I've got some familiarity with the way they encounter this work and the ways they respond to it. I've also taught it quite a number of times to students in a high school honors program here in central Connecticut, and so I've seen the way very advanced and accomplished and intelligent students deal with the work, and in my experience, it's very successful. It's the kind of thing that really brings out students' ingenuity and curiosity and intellectual talents quite successfully. So it's a great teaching text, I think. Of course, not everybody is going to like it, and in particular, young women quite frequently will not love Hemingway, and they will be concerned about that question. How do we know that he's not a misogynist who prefers nature to people because it doesn't talk back to him? And let me just say in advance that I don't think there's actually there's an easy answer to that question. It's a hard question, and it's a relevant question. It's actually important. I would just say in advance, and I hope we'll talk more about this, that Hemingway is kind of a misogynist writer, and he's not just incidentally so, it's a kind of philosophical commitment that's strongly related to the rest of his work. So how that's so, we should go on to say, I think. So let me continue. So what's important about In Our Time from my perspective? Well, it's Hemingway's first important book. He wrote it very quickly, and it was really a kind of remarkable book in the way that it brought together very suddenly his talents. As a young man, he'd been living in Paris, working very hard as a journalist, and also studying at the feet of Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound, working in the world of avant-garde little magazines, and making himself an artist, in part by dint of sheer will and commitment. And it's interesting to see how much of his early writing is not especially distinguished, and then bam, all of a sudden there's this really extraordinary book by this very young person, and it's quite a success and is going to lead him on to other still more impressive successes. Here, just as an example, is one of the little magazines that Hemingway published parts of in our time in. This is the Little Review, one of the many small coterie subscription-based magazines that flourished in the bohemian circles of Paris and London and New York in the 1920s. Hemingway was a part of this world. People often talk about his training in the newspaper business, which was, of course, important, but equally important, maybe more so, at least from my perspective, is that Hemingway really did make himself a pupil of Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound, and took the techniques that they had been nurturing and did something quite extraordinary and new with them. So it's helpful in that light to know, I think, that In Our Time was published initially by Boney and Liveright, which is a kind of a historical curiosity, but a fascinating one. Boney and Liveright was a hot young publishing house of its day, was an imitator of at that time the relatively new Alfred A. Knopf house, which had been created in 1917, I believe, and which distinguished itself by selling very prestigious young literature, often from European artists in luxuriously designed books, and discovering that there was a market niche there. Boney and Liveright came along to imitate them and carved out a role for themselves, selling new experimental writing to a curious public. So this was an opportunity in which writers like Hemingway and many of the people that we really remember from that era could develop their work in ways that previously had not really been possible. And as somebody asked how the book was received, and it was received very well. It's not a runaway bestseller. The Sun Also Rises, published the following year, would become a runaway bestseller and would make Hemingway famous, but it's a big success, and it gives him some of the capital that allows him to move on to Scribner's, where he can really parlay his talents into much greater renown. So part of what's important about that from my perspective is that we can see this book as important and accomplished in its own right, but we can see it also as part of a much larger historical development that someone commented on and asking about where this book fits in the history of literary modernism. And it is a monument in that history. I think it's like The Wasteland, which was published in 1922, Ulysses, published in 1922, Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf's great novel, published in 1925. These are all, of course, extraordinary works in their own right, but they're part of this miraculous era of literary modernism when techniques and styles that had been fostered in the small world of bohemian circles in little magazines, where there is suddenly a kind of mass audience and a mass interest in them, and where new literary styles can reach a much larger public. And go on to achieve, surprisingly at the time, to the people of the day, great popular success, and then, of course, enduring influence. So one of the things our students, I think, are oftentimes not especially interested in this, but it's quite relevant. One of the things that's important about In Our Time is that it becomes an aesthetic model for the way that literary writing is going to develop, especially in the United States, over the whole remaining course of the 20th century. A more direct way to put that would be to say it's a text that is imitated again and again and again in MFA programs. So the story cycle and the prose style becomes kind of model for what people want to do if they want to be serious writers in the years to come.
Sean, we have a question here.
Yep.
Was Hemingway influenced by Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio?
Yes, he was. And Anderson was a patron to Hemingway. And Hemingway did to Anderson as he did to many people who were close to him and kind to him and supportive of him. Hemingway turned on him quite viciously and published and wrote a really nasty parody of Anderson called Torrents of Spring, which was deeply injurious to Anderson. So yeah, there is certainly a model there for some of the things that Hemingway does. Here, by the way, is a picture of Hemingway's family, and this is sort of related, I guess. On the right-hand side is the very young Hemingway. As you can probably tell, one of the things to note about him was that he, along with the rest of his family, was strikingly good-looking and incredibly charismatic, apparently. He had a capacity to excite fascination and devotion in many people, Anderson being one of them. So that was one part of his rise to success. Another thing to note here is simply that this is a classic picture of the American Victorian family, which is part of what Hemingway, along with his younger contemporaries in the 1920s, is going to turn against quite nastily. So
we have an interesting comment here from one of our participants. I completely agree with what was said a bit earlier. My students often, and surprisingly to me, see a relationship between Stein's, let's see, the comment just disappeared. Here we go. Between Stein's style in her Cubist portraits, especially Picasso and Ada, with Hemingway's in our time. And the participant would like us to highlight his debt to other writers, as well as emphasize his own quintessential stylistic hallmarks as we get into the discussion of the modernist style and aesthetic. So let's keep that in mind. Another person writes, an insightful student commented this semester that Hemingway's macho and no-fluff philosophy seems out of place or surprising in someone who cares so deeply and intricately about literary technique and the reception of his own work among the works of others. I didn't have a good response to that, except to note that part of his desire for mastery included a desire of the mastery of these new techniques. That is an interesting contradiction in Hemingway.
Yeah.
I mean, he is the macho guy, and yet he is a very sensitive artist and to some extent an intellectual. I mean, he had an extensive library and he traveled with books all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Though you might also note that in the first part of Big Two-Hearted River, one of the things that Nick is leaving behind is books. So there is, in his writing, as there is in the writing of many of his contemporaries, a kind of paradoxical attitude towards literature, a kind of anti-literary literariness, or an embarrassment about literariness. One way to see this, by the way, is that literary does not become an insult in the way that we might use the term insult until the early part of the 20th century, when, if you follow it out in the OED, you can see that's when it starts getting used as a negative as well as positive description. Another way to see this would be maybe to look at this comment from Hemingway. If you take your eyes a little bit down that slide and look at Hemingway's comment to Ezra Pound, you get a little taste of what he was like as a young man when he says, "Fuck literature." Hemingway's mother's response to his own writing at this time was to say that every page fills me with sick loathing. So that's to my mind, that's a way of looking at that paradox and seeing that to Hemingway, it wasn't actually that paradoxical. That is, the paradox of being a kind of macho writer and an avowedly taciturn personality who was also deeply interested in literature and the arts. For Hemingway, as for many of his contemporaries, literary excellence and literary experiment seemed to have a natural anti-middle class, anti-bourgeois bent, and he, like many of his contemporaries, imagined bourgeois life to be symbolized especially by mothers. Women, mothers, family. So it was quite possible to be both a misogynist and to be an ambitious artist. In fact, to think of them as being the same mission in a way.
Yeah, I think one good classroom exercise would be to show that picture of the Hemingway family that you showed and make the comment that you did about this was a typical Victorian family, and then have your students kind of deconstruct that photo. How does that read? What is it about that family that would fill that woman with sick loathing as she read her son's work?
I think what Grace Hemingway understood was that Hemingway wanted to take that family apart. He wanted to humiliate it, to embarrass it, to see it as decadent and to be scorned. And that was, in some respects, strangely, entirely consistent with a kind of very nasty edge to misogyny. Another way to describe this would be to say that part of the power of this book, part of its enduring power, and certainly part of its power at its time, was the way in which it took World War I and the ugliness and disaster of World War I to be typical of modern civilization. Hemingway's view was probably a lot like Pound's, who had written in Hugh, Selwyn, Moberly in 1920 about the myriad that had died in World War I for what he called a botched civilization, and going on to say, call it an old bitch gone in the teeth. So for Pound, civilization was despicable in some respects, and it was also best described as an old bitch. That's probably not too far from Hemingway's view. So to my mind, that's all very interesting. It's in some ways not just individual or idiosyncratic on Hemingway's part. It's typical of the young intellectuals and artists of his day. But it's also joined to something that's still more interesting, I think, or more impressive, which is the extraordinary artistic accomplishment of this book. And one way to think about it is just as a book of some very nasty and cutting sentiments in extraordinarily beautiful and accomplished form. And so to have an understanding of it, we should have some appreciation of what those forms involved. I'm going to suggest to you that part of the reason the book is so important is that it creates, or it brings to prominence some new literary styles, but it also demands in that respect some new styles of reading, which turn out to be highly influential. It's one reason why it's a great teaching text, because you can use it to show your students how they can indeed be very intensive and careful readers. And I'll suggest that there's three reading skills in particular that are very useful to keep in mind as you're thinking about this book. One is reading for style. This is something that Hemingway certainly cared a great deal about, that is appreciating the artistry, the control in particular, the performance of the writer, who is implicitly, almost explicitly comparable to the toreador or the skier or the athlete, the fisherman in the book, somebody who's doing something extraordinarily difficult and demanding but beautiful at the same time. Maybe more importantly, reading for implication, appreciating what is suggested but not said. This is the famous iceberg scenario of Hemingway's writing. It's one of the ways, too, I think, that it's helpful to see that he's a little bit like Stein, who was a huge influence on him, but also different. Hemingway takes from Stein the very simplistic diction that she had pioneered, which seemed to their contemporaries very unliterary, not to have the qualities of cultural refinement that people associated with literature. But Hemingway used it in a way that Stein didn't so much, which is to imply, of course, that there's something that's not being said, and to ask us to read very carefully for what is implicit but not explicit. And finally, I want to suggest that in our time, it asks us to read for juxtaposition. It asks us to take note of what is implied in the echoes and allusions between different elements of the book. If you've been reading the book for a second or third time, or if you're reading very carefully, one thing you might note is that little images, motifs, formal elements crop up in story after story after story. So, of course, you see Nick on a train towards the beginning of the book, and then you see Nick get off a train at the end of the book, and you encounter other people getting off trains at various places. You see that Harold Krebs is standing before a river in a photograph, although the river doesn't appear in the photograph, and later you see Nick standing by a river. You see a government minister in Greece taken out for execution, although he's suffering from typhoid, so that he's sitting down when he's executed. And later on, you see Sam Cardinella hanged in a sitting position where he's paralyzed by fear. So there's all sorts of little symbolic echoes and formal patterns that give some implication of a larger design to the book. If we read attentively for those things, we can see we can see qualities in the book that we might not otherwise notice. And this is, in my experience, very helpful and sometimes very exciting for students. So let me give you an idea about why this might be important from my perspective. I think if you look at the book in this way, you can think of it as something like a cubist novel, as it looks like it has the elements of a conventional novel. It has a protagonist, or somebody like a protagonist, Nick Adams. There's a storyline that we can see in his various appearances in the book. He is surrounded by secondary characters and associates, that is, the kind of people who might have made up a novelistic canvas in a more conventional story. There is perhaps implicitly development and resolution in his story, but none of these things are apparent in any kind of strongly coherent way or any traditional way. Instead, they're suggested, they're implied. We're encouraged, I think, to see them and to see the way they're not fully realized, but to be aware that there's something like the outlines of a novel here. In fact, I think very appropriately, Paul Rosenfeld, reviewing in our time for the New Republic in 1925, recognized this. And he makes two very important observations about the novel, I think, in this excellent review. One is that in our time is like Stravinsky and like Cubist painting, that they all create, Rosenfeld says, a primitive modern idiom by combining the use of direct, crude, rudimentary forms of the primitive classes with the textures and rhythms of the mechanical industrial world. That is, for Rosenfeld, as for other critics at the time, very attentive critics, one of the things that Picasso and Stravinsky, Hemingway, Eliot, Joyce, and other like-minded writers were doing was creating something strange by managing to combine in some way the implication of primitive qualities with very modern industrial qualities. One way we can see this, and we'll return to this, I think, is that you get, say, the bullfight and the railroad in this book. One striking way you get it, you might remember, is that just before we turn to Big Two-Hearted River, we get the chapter that describes the death of Mera, and his death is described as being like a movie, cinematograph, speeded up. So you get I think from Hemingway's perspective, a primitive ritual described in relation to a modern idiom. More importantly, though, Rosenfeld points out that the book, like a Cubist painting, gives us plastic elements accurately felt, which are opposed point against point, so that a whole is brought into view. And I think this is a very perceptive observation, so I'd like to pursue it with you a little bit and ask you, what's the whole that's being brought into view? What's the big story that the collection as a whole hints at without quite giving us in a really clear way? And my suggestion to you is that it's a very typical story of the American 1920s. You might think about Nick Carraway from The Great Gatsby as an example. It's a disenchanted prodigal son story. That is, it's a story about a boy who grows up, he leaves his family, he encounters the brutality and spiritual corruption of the modern world, and he ultimately returns to a kind of provisional and uncertain home. Nick Adams is a little bit like Nick Carraway, in other words, in the books of the same year. So how could we see this? Well, we can see it, I think, in the juxtaposition of the parts of the book, and we might do that just by looking at the first two parts of this larger canvas, the story on the quay at Smyrna and the story Indian Camp. What do we see if we compare them to each other? What elements do they share in common, and how do they differ? Let me just take us on to looking at passages from these stories. So here are the first and concluding lines of On the Quay at Smyrna. The strange thing was, he said, how they screamed every night at midnight. I do not know why they screamed at that time. We were in the harbor, and were all on the pier, and at midnight they started screaming. We used to turn the searchlight on them to quiet them. It was all a pleasant business. My word, yes, a pleasant business. So that's On the Quay at Smyrna, and if we're reading the collection, we've read the story that begins and ends with these lines, and then we're going to go immediately to the next story, and the next story is the famous Indian Camp. So here are the opening and concluding lines of Indian Camp. At the lakeshore, there was another rowboat drawn up. The two Indians stood waiting. In the concluding lines, the sun was coming up over the hills. A bass jumped, making a circle in the water. Nick trailed his hand in the water. It felt warm in the sharp chill of the morning. In the early morning on the lake, sitting in the stern of the boat with his father rowing, he felt quite sure he would never die. So these stories are similar in some respects, They share some elements, but they're also quite different in some ways. So let me pause here and ask you, what do you see here? Where are the similarities and where are the differences, and what might be important about them?
Okay, Sean, while we're waiting for responses to those questions, we've gotten some interesting comments here. First of all, regarding the iceberg theory, while I do agree that often much more is implied than what is said, I do find that students, and this is interesting, this story is dropped into the context of a class. The students have recently been reading, say, Hawthorne, very different, of course, can look too hard for symbolism and pose interpretations of symbols, I think, that are a real stretch. So how do you teach the collection to avoid this kind of overreaching, overinterpreting? Also regarding the iceberg theory, a colleague of mine believes that Hemingway put forth this theory to mess with the critics. I understand that he was not fond of critics, and I could really see Hemingway doing this. What are your thoughts on that while we're waiting for responses to your discussion question?
Yeah, I think they're both excellent questions, and they're hard questions. I'd say about the first one, how do you prevent students from overreading? The best way to prevent them from overreading, I think, is to argue with their overinterpretations. But more specifically, what I try and do with this book in particular is not to go for the big symbolism, but to go for the more pointed examples or the more very particular examples. I'll mention another one later in this discussion where there's only a number of possible interpretations that you might come up with of the scene. They're quite limited and they're quite specific, and they're the kinds of pragmatic considerations involving things like characters' motivation, which students can usually grasp pretty quickly. So personally, I'm not at all interested in big themes, life, mortality, death, etc. I'm much more interested in talking to students about very focused questions. So in this particular example, I would say, so on the quay at Smyrna and Indian camp, what looks similar about just the elements that you have just looked at, and what looks different?
Then we have some comments there. There's water in both.
Bingo. Yes.
Repetition of words and phrases. Trauma permeates the stories and permeates the collection. They both are characterized by blunt, frank language. In Indian camp, the women's screams are dismissed by the doctor because they're not important. In the quay at Smyrna, the screams are presented by the speaker as the frame and symbol for the horror of the whole event. And we have a question here. Is this because of the two different narrative perspectives in these stories? Nick's father tries not to feel the human element, presumably as a professional here. This is his way of processing the brutality that he saw or experienced. Hemingway is a master of setting an event, but not time or time frame. We're getting on some other issues. He's very in the moment most of the time. And then some similarities, gaps, and omissions. So I think we've got some good responses there.
Yeah, excellent responses, in fact. That seems exactly right to me about time. One of the ways in which this is not like a conventional narrative is that the time frame does not develop in classic ways, the beginning, middle, and end. One thing we know for reading carefully is that when we begin on the quay at Smyrna, we must be in something like the historical present. The year in which those events take place is 1922. And when we read Indian Camp, we must be doing something like a flashback, moving to at least 10 years or more earlier, because we know that Nick Adams has experienced the war as an adult, and we know that he's a young boy in that story. But we don't get any ligature. There's no connection. There's no transition. We have to figure out these things for ourselves.
Wouldn't you say that, Sean, wouldn't you say that's a characteristic of modernism, that shattering of the time frame and moving back and forth?
Yeah, absolutely. Very typical. To take away, I think, imply that something like the conventional understanding of continuity of time, the direction of history, that this has all been disrupted in some way and that artistic forms need to be consistent with it. But I would not talk about that usually with my undergraduates because for most of them that's not of great interest and it's a little bit over their heads, at least initially. So I would try and be more pointed and more specific still in talking about the elements of those two scenes and on the quay at Smyrna Indian Camp. I would say to a student who said, hey, there's water in both these stories, I would say, yes, exactly. What else is there in both these stories? We are at the water's edge in both these stories, people will say. And I'll say, great, what else? What else do you see? And somebody will say, well, let's see. In both of these stories, we have some kind of cross-cultural encounter. In Indian camp, we have a meeting between Native Americans and Anglo-Americans. In On the Quay at Smyrna, we have Turks, Greeks, and somebody else. And I say, great, yes, that is exactly what I'm looking for. What else? What else do we have in common? Childbirth. Childbirth. In both these stories, and in fact, many of these stories, childbirth, difficult childbirth, of course. So we have a breech birth in on the Indian camp, excuse me, and in On the Quay at Smyrna, we have many people giving birth held up under blankets. And in the next chapter, the next little vignette, we're similarly going to have people on the road to Karagach and, women giving birth to babies in carts. So there's a number of such elements you could start to see when you put these things together and say, I'll say to my students, look, there's a parallel being set up here. Two stories about cross-cultural encounters at the water's edge in which violence and trauma and childbirth are all featured. And then I will say, so what's the difference? So what is the difference? What differences do you see in, say, point of view or in the kind of movement that the characters experience or in the development of the story?
Hey, Sean, while we're waiting for responses to that, we've got some really good questions and comments here about Indian camp. Why do you think young Nick feels sure he will never die? And does the he at the end, in the last sentence of Indian camp, does that he refer to Nick or his father?
Yeah, I think deliberately ambiguous. But why would Nick think this? Because he's a child. Because he's a child. And what this line does for us is to provide a very heavy foreshadowing, I think. Young Nick is a child living in one kind of world, and he's going to grow up and live in a different kind of world. He's going to grow up to find out that, yes, he is going to die, and his father is probably dead already, certainly has disappeared. So what that tells us is you've got a bigger narrative about maturation, painful maturation.
We have a very good suggestion here about an answer to that question, why Nick thinks he wouldn't die. Perhaps from Nick's childlike point of view, he could feel sure he would never die because he sees an Indian woman and the baby survive a traumatic, life-threatening situation, while the father takes his own life. So is that possibly there? And so perhaps Nick is thinking of death in the context of choice, to live or take one's own life.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that seems quite plausible. I would also just say that the final lines of that story, and let me just bring you back to them. So here's the last lines. The sun was coming up over the hills. A bass jumped, making a circle in the water. Nick trailed his hand in the water. It felt warm in the sharp chill of the morning. In the early morning on the lake, sitting in the stern of the boat with his father rowing, he felt quite sure he would never die. Life goes on. The sun comes up. The darkness is past. The suffering is over. The cycles of life continue. If you are familiar with Hemingway's next major book, The Sun Also Rises, you might know that it begins with two epigraphs. One epigraph is the famous line from Gertrude Stein, in which she says, "You are all, alas, a lost generation." And the other is a quotation from Ecclesiastes, the sun also riseth, the sun setteth, and the sun also rises. So what you get in that novel is a juxtaposition of two conditions: a lost generation, that is a generation presumably without a future, perhaps without a past, and then a suggestion of something deeper, older, more traditional. Life goes on. Here, likewise, sun comes up, life goes on.
And we have in response to your question about what's different between On the Quay and Indian Camp, participant writes, I think they differ in tone. I take the last line, pleasant business, of On the Quay as bitter and sarcastic. I take the ending of Indian Camp as serious.
Right. That seems exactly right to me. One way that you can show that to your students, one thing that I show to my students is if I look at the first line of on the Kate Smyrna, I'll ask the students who's speaking, this, and what do we know about the difference between these two stories just from point of view if we look at the first line. So the strange thing was, he said, how they screamed every night at midnight. And then at the lakeshore, there was another rowboat drawn up. So I'll ask my students, what's the difference in the point of view of those two stories? And eventually what they will arrive at is that in Indian camp, you have a story that is entirely focalized through the perspective that is seen through the eyes of a young child. And we are in the consciousness of that young child, and there's no separation between narrator and protagonist, which is an approach that's very conducive to sincerity. On the other hand, the strange thing was, he said. So the first thing we know is that the narrator is not the person who is speaking these words. That is, there's a separation between narrator and speaker, which is very conducive to irony. We can look at the perspective of the speaker and the perspective of the narrator as being different. And if we're reading carefully, we'll have noted that the diction is also distinctive. So it was all a pleasant business. My word, yes, a pleasant business. What we should recognize from that diction is that this is a British naval officer speaking. So it is certainly not Hemingway or Nick Adams or somebody like that. Mm-hmm. So there's one big difference: sincerity versus irony. What are
we've got some other comments here. At the end of Indian Camp, Jefferson writes, the father seems to deliver some sort of complaint when he notes that women hardly ever kill themselves. That's an interesting perspective on that. I never took it that way. We have another comment here about the differences. I think they differ in let's see. We read that one here. Let's see. I agree. We talked about a difference in tone. Participant writes, I might agree with the tone being different in both pieces, but overall they both still reflect a specific point of view, his own, this is Nick's, and his limited life experience in that small town. So that would go along with what you were saying about Nick being a small boy. Yeah. I also think Hemingway is highlighting the hope and naivete of youth, rising sun, right, just like the naivete of the Victorian pre-World War I world, and he is consciously rejecting the possibility of his own mortality. Right. Regarding the comment about women, this goes back to about the woman, about the women not killing themselves being a complaint. Women hardly ever killing themselves. Could this be implying that women are stronger than men, at least in this story? I'm pairing that comment by the doctor with the woman's survival and the father's suicide. Men are confused with all of the issues surrounding war, which is thought to be male-dominated, but they are focused in performing C-sections. The issues around war, I suppose, are focused in performing C-sections, something you would not think is a male-dominated procedure. What do you think about those? How would you respond to those comments?
Okay. Well, let me just back up a little bit and say, give a quick sense of the kinds of things that I will hope eventually to lead my students to in thinking about these two stories. So I want to say, these are both stories about a cross-cultural encounter at the water's edge in which childbirth, violence, and trauma are featured. But they're enormously different in tone, in setting, in point of view, and the differences are as important as the similarities. We have first, indeed, the kind of pre-World War I Victorian perspective of the innocent young boy who thinks that he will never die, for whom violence and death are exceptional. They're rare. Nick says to his father, does this happen often? And Nick's father says, no, doesn't happen that often. Do people kill themselves often? Nope, doesn't happen that often. Good or bad, and I don't think there's really a suggestion that that's bad. It's an unusual situation. On the Quay at Smyrna, it's not unusual. There is not one woman who's having a difficult childbirth. There are many women who are having difficult childbirth. Death is not rare at all. It's commonplace. It's a scene of mass suffering and brutality. The difference is a scene of humanitarian disaster and a scene of humanitarian intervention that turns out to be successful. One of the things that I will suggest to my students is we might see Dr. Adams differently if we think about him in relation to the British officer who speaks in On the Quay at Smyrna. What do we know about the British officer on the quay at Smyrna? Well, we know probably that he's disgusted, that he finds the scene grotesque, that he is ironic about all of this, that it is a most pleasant business, and we also know that he's brutal. We know that, for example, when he hears screams at night from the quay, what he's describing is a scene of humanitarian disaster and refugees who have been forced out of their homes by war. We know that what he does at night when he hears them screaming is to turn a searchlight on them. We know, in other words, that he is a man who's been brutalized by war. I will say to my students, in that context, how do you look at what Dr. Adams says when he says, I don't hear the women's screams because they're not important? Now, some students will say, well, of course, Hemingway doesn't think women's screams are important. Dr. Adams doesn't think women's screams are important. And I will want to follow that up by saying, can that be true? Can Dr. Adams really think that this woman's screams are not important? Let's remember why he's there. He has arrived at this camp in the middle of the night after traveling across a lake, walking through the woods, and has come to save a woman's life. He leaves promising that he will return the next morning. We know that he is probably not doing this for remuneration. So why might it be that he says the woman's screams are not important? One possibility is, of course, that yes, he genuinely doesn't think that women's screams are important. Another possibility is that he's a good doctor. He's a good doctor who is going to save the life of a patient because he has the skill to do emergency surgery, which requires him to concentrate on what he's doing and to ignore what could otherwise be a distraction. So I think my personal view is that this is what Hemingway wishes us to see, that he wishes us to see the difference between a kind of stoicism that has good uses and brutality, and that this is the difference between our time and another time. Our time is a time of brutality. Our time is a time where authorities are not heroic, where lives are not saved, where suffering is not rare, where it doesn't seem that life is going to go on. Another time was different. This is, I think, the big theme of the book. So here, by the way, this is the context for On the Quay at Smyrna. It doesn't mean probably for most of us much nowadays, but in 1925, the quay at Smyrna would have been referred to a famous event. This is a consequence of the Greco-Turkish War of 1922. It's a scene of ethnic cleansing and mass suffering, humanitarian disaster. In other words, if you said Smyrna in 1925, people then would have heard something like what we hear in the words Sarajevo or Rwanda. Brutal ethnic warfare, mass suffering, terrible brutality, and ineffectual or craven action by the kinds of powers who are represented by the British officer in that story. This is an important element of this book, by the way. We get scenes of World War I in the collection, but also a number of scenes from this Greco-Turkish War of 1922. So it had a powerful effect, it looks like, on Hemingway and seemed to him representative. One thing to know about this, by the way, is that that war is a consequence of the way that World War I brought about the end of the pre-World War I imperial order. So the Ottoman Empire breaks up. It's not clear how countries are going to be divided. The Greeks and Turks go to war, and the result is ethnic cleansing, basically. So this is what gives the framing perspective to Hemingway's book. In other words, I think he's suggesting to us, our time is a horrible time.
We have a question here about Dr. Adams and the idea that he was responding in a professional way to the woman's screams. Adams's post-operative exhilaration and George's irritated stomping off seem to complicate that interpretation for me. A character within the story seems to know him, Dr. Adams, and to reject his ideas, but it's only temporary. So how does that post-operative exhilaration reflect upon Dr. Adams' professionalism? Because he does say, well, this is one for the books. I did it with a jackknife and fishing gut.
Leaders, yeah. The medical journals are significant, I think. Dr. Adams says this is one for the journals. When people do great things, they feel exhilarated. When doctors save people's lives, they feel exhilarated. I don't think there's anything strange about that. The more striking thing, I think, probably would be that it doesn't last. The exhilaration is short-lived because there is some further brutality to be encountered, because he comes across the death of the father. If Dr. Adams was genuinely a cynical or brutal or uncaring individual, you would expect him to have a cynical or brutal or uncaring reaction to that event. He doesn't. The British officer on the quay at Smyrna does. So I think the important thing for Hemingway, and we may not share this view about this kind of person, but I think for Hemingway the importance is that Dr. Adams in the story, from the viewpoint of his child, is one kind of person, a good father. A good father, a good doctor, whose stature doesn't last. It's replaced by something else. So I'm going to skip over this here, but one thing I would just suggest is that it's relevant to this that the title in our time comes from the Book of Common Prayer. Hemingway, like a lot of his contemporaries, and as he did in The Sun Also Rises, was given to ironic uses of Christian religious texts. So here's the responses in the Book of Common Prayer. O Lord, save thy people and bless thine inheritance. Give peace in our time, O Lord. For it is thou, Lord, only that make us dwell in safety. O God, make clean our hearts within us, and take not Holy Spirit from us. So what's the implication here? Or, well, I'll leave that as a question. What do you think the implication of this is?
Okay, any comments on the implications of appropriating language from the Book of Common Prayer for this, in an ironic way for the title? Any comments? Well, certainly the Lord has not granted us peace in our time. Yeah, a thorough rejection of the past. Post-World War I sees a rise in atheism and disillusionment with religion. Reminds this person of T.S. Eliot.
Exactly. Yeah.
His parents enforced a lot of scripture on the Hemingways as kids, didn't they? Was Grace Hemingway a scripture reader? We see that in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife.
Yeah, let's go on and let me ask about that. I don't want to belabor that. From my perspective, what's important about that is that yes, indeed, like T.S. Eliot, there is no grace in our time. We live in a world from which God has absconded. There is no grace for us. There is no spirituality. It is a debased world. So this is, I think, the big framework of this book. Once there was a different time, that's not our time. And one way we can see this is to consider the Doctor and the Doctor's Wife by comparison to Indian Camp. So here's the first and concluding lines of the Doctor and the Doctor's Wife. Dick Bolton came from the Indian camp to cut up logs for Nick's father. He brought his son Eddie and another Indian named Billy Tabashaw with him. They came in through the back gate out of the woods. And then the concluding lines. I know where there's black squirrels, Daddy, Nick said. All right, said his father, let's go there. So when I'm discussing this with my students, I'll say, what's happened between Indian camp and the Doctor and the Doctor's Wife? How have the situations of the characters changed? How have other important details changed? So what do you think?
Okay. What's the difference between the two stories? How have the details changed? How have the situations changed? Well, for one thing here, the Indians are coming to the Adams house as opposed to Dr. Adams going over to the Indian camp.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other differences here? The Indians here, they have names.
They have names, yes, exactly. They are no longer faceless representatives of an alien culture. Now they are individual people. Mm-hmm. Yes, what else?
Let's see. It's easier for folks to argue with Dr. Adams now. The Indians have some agency.
Exactly. He is no longer in charge.
Yeah, yeah. And we see that at the end of the story too. His son is leading him off. He's not leading his son. Hemingway is asking for a new start. In this case, the son, okay, well, that's not quite on target for what we're asking now. But I think we've gotten some differences there. What do you think, John?
That all seems exactly right to me, and it's usually a big discovery for my students. They will note, oh, there's Indians in this story, but they're no longer just a collective. Now they're individuals. In fact, they're no longer sharply distinct from the world of Nick and his father. They have names, they have uncertain identities. Dick Bolton, is he actually Native American? Is he white, pretending to be Native American? Is he a half-breed in some way? He's confusing. He's also difficult. He's not in his place. He doesn't respect Nick's father. Nick's father is no longer in charge. He's not in charge of the Indians that he wants to work for them. He's not morally well-defined as he was before. He's involved in some kind of activity of which he does not feel proud. He's no longer in control of his family. He has a wife in the story where he did not before. And she is an annoyance to him, quite clearly. She is a little bit like Harold Krebs' mother, and then I think from Hemingway's perspective, she's a bit passive-aggressive, in addition to being a Christian Scientist, not something that Hemingway looked fondly on. Also, you might have remembered that in Indian Camp, Nick's father says, that's one for the medical journals. In The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, he looks at a pile of medical journals which he has not read, and he feels irritated. In other words, in all respects, Dr. Adams has come down in the world, and the world is less certain and less defined. And indeed, in the final lines, Nick is in charge. So the suggestion here, I think, and it's a suggestion that's just by implication, is that Nick is growing up. Nick is growing up, and he's realizing that the world is not as clearly defined as it was in the past, and his father is not heroic, and he's not going to live forever. And this is all a kind of story of painful growing of consciousness, but it's one which we see only by changing narrative modes and changing detail. It's all by implication.
John, just to follow up on your comment about sort of degeneration of Dr. Adams here. You mentioned that when he went to Indian Camp, he was not looking for remuneration. Now in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, money does seem to be an issue. The profession of saving lives has been traded for making money on stolen wood, a drop of swords.
Exactly.
We have a question here. Should we make much of Dr. Adams cleaning his shotgun in bed?
Well, we are told that he likes his gun very much. This is the kind of thing that students will sometimes, knowing about Hemingway's family and his own life, will want to read a lot into. It's, of course, interesting and relevant. I try not to go in that direction with my students because I want them to focus very, very narrowly on the things that they might really plausibly read into the small details of the text. So I would prefer for them to note that he is a man who is not does not have the stature he once did, and is not exercising the power he once did, and who is holding with some fondness an object that might be thought to give him compensatory power, which he likes a great deal.
Here's another good question. So, in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, has the Doctor changed, or is it just Nick's view of him?
Yeah. Well, we don't know, but I would say yes, Nick's view, that what we're getting is a change in Nick's view. Nick is growing up, realizing the world is more complicated than he thought, and this is a painful discovery for him. Part of what's weird about this is that we might want to say, oh, well, look, a world in which Indians and whites share a common context, and where fathers are not heroes, and where sons can rise in stature, and where people are part of families and societies, that all is an improvement in some respects. I don't think that's the view that's implicit in this book, though. I think Hemingway is genuinely like someone like T.S. Eliot or maybe F. Scott Fitzgerald, that is a person who looks at modern commercial society in the 1920s and says it's despiritualized, it's disenchanted, it is a world of corruption and confusion, where yes, everything is for sale, Fathers are not heroes. People's place in the world is not well defined, and things are disappointing. In other words, I guess one of the things I'm suggesting is that Hemingway is an artistic progressive, but politically and culturally genuinely a deeply conservative person at this point in his life, as many of his contemporaries are. One common response to World War I was to think of a kind of strong conservative view as cutting edge, hot, young.
We have a comment relating to what you just said here about World War I and its effect on religious belief. Just person would like to have you address that a little more. World War I, in terms of religious belief, was very corrosive, right? I mean, there's massive death. Religion took a real blow in the light of all that slaughter,
right?
Culturally.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. All kinds of established beliefs, all forms of what younger intellectuals and writers in the 20s will regard as false pieties, all seem discredited, badly discredited in the 1920s. So one way you can define yourself as an ambitious and aggressive and innovative young intellectual in this era is to be dismissive of the false pieties of your elders. At the same time, in doing that, to long for something more authoritative than whatever existed in your past, which is something that in our time, like, say, the Wasteland, I think does for us. And let me give you an idea of one way I think this is present in the book, and I suggest to my students, and this is to address this question of the chapters. What are they? Why are they in this book? What are they about? And I will ask my students, so what's in those chapters? What do they have in common? How do they differ? I'll come back to this in just a second. What will come up in conversation in those situations is that astute readers, good students, will say, they're all about violence. They're all about violence, and they're all about violence in a way that seems separate from the lives of the characters in the more conventional stories, which seems exactly right to me. There are scenes of extraordinary violence, in other words. Extraordinary violences that take place in another world from the lives of middle-class white Americans, in other words. So I will arrive at that with my students, and then I'll say, what's the difference among them? As you have lots of scenes of violence, are there any differences in those scenes of violence? Some of the scenes of violence are of war and revolution. World War I, the Greco-Turkish War, the Greek Revolution that deposes King Constantine. And those scenes are scenes of typically brutality. Some of the scenes are like this one from chapter 8. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 Hungarians got into a cigar store at 15th Street and Grand Avenue. Boyle shot one off the seat of the wagon and one out of the wagon box. Whops, said Boyle. I could tell Whops a mile off. Well, these are the opening and concluding lines of chapter 8. And then the next chapter, chapter 9, is this. The first matador got the horn through his sword hand, and the crowd hooted him. The second matador slipped, and the bull caught him through the belly. The kid came out and had to kill 5 bulls because you can't have more than 3 matadors. He finally made it. He sat down in the sand and puked, and they held a cape over him while the crowd hollered and threw things down into the bull ring. So I will ask my students, what's the difference between these scenes, apart from the similarities? So what do you think? Do you see any differences here?
Do you see any differences in the scenes? We have one question here that we might respond to while we're waiting for answers here. Person writes that one of the hardest things to teach for U.S. students is bullfighting.
Yeah.
Do you find that hard, Sean? And if you do, can you offer any hints while we wait?
Yeah. So yes, most of my students will say bullfighting is disgusting abuse of animals, basically. And what I could say is that may well be true, But what view of it do you think that Hemingway has in this scene? Is that his view? So one of the virtues of reading literature is contending with points of views that may be different from your own. What view do you think Hemingway has?
Okay, while we're waiting for a response to that, we have some comments about the inner chapters. For today's students, the inner chapters might seem like flashbacks and memories that create constantly unsettled texture, disrupting any continuity and development along the lines of along the other stories, along the lines of the other stories. Something like PTSD.
Right.
Very interesting comparison here.
Right.
And we have some other difference might be that the bullfighting scenes are related to some attempt at honor, whereas the war stories are not. My students would say that there's no difference between bullfighting and the war. They're both about survival and being lucky. And then his feelings are pretty clear when you show them Romero and the Sun Also Rises. You almost need the two together. But I think one of the things that fascinated Hemingway about bullfighting is that it's a way to control death through art, through grace. I mean, you've got that monstrous bull charging you, and all the matador has between him and it is a little piece of cloth.
Right.
And he's managing to keep that death at bay through his grace, his style, his artistry.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Hemingway thinks. I think he does think that bullfighting is beautiful and honorable. He called it a tragedy, meaning by tragedy that it was a ritualistic form to deal with the existential realities. It was a confrontation and artistic encounter with and taming of death. That's different from what we get here. Squalor. This is closer, I think, to what Hemingway sees in World War I and what he sees in the crime wave of the United States in the 1920s. Squalor, squalid, brutal violence, not beautiful, controlled, ritualized violence. And not many of my students will be unsympathetic to this, of course, as anyone might be. But one way you can bring out the significance for Hemingway of this is to ask what other differences there are between the kind of participants in violence in these stories, or in this kind of scene, and what you get in the bullfight. So what eventually students will arrive at is, oh, well, look, what we have here in the streets of Chicago in the crime wave of the 1920s is ethnic conflict. Boyle and Drevitz shooting wops and being entirely dismissive of the people who they have extrajudicially executed. And here, what you have is not just death and violence made ritualized and beautiful. You have the implication of a shared culture. Is when you get the line, the kid came out and had to kill 5 bulls because you can't have more than 3 matadors. You can ask your students, what does that mean? You can't have more than 3 matadors. And of course, the implication is that there are rules here. There is a ritual that is shared and understood by all. Likewise, you can say, what does it mean that when he sat down in the sand and puked and they held a cape over him while the crowd hollered and threw things down into the bull ring? What's the difference between that kind of treatment and what Drevitz and Boyle deal out to the Hungarians in the previous story? And what students sometimes miss, but they will see quickly if you draw their attention to it, is that the crowd is throwing things down in the ring because they're exuberant at the heroic performance of the matador here. It's not because they despise him, it's because they recognize that he has done something according to their expectations that is beautiful.
We have some questions about the ambiguity of violence in the book. How do the women giving birth in bad ways fit into this collection of classes of violence? Yeah. And another person writes about the bullfighting. Don't forget the horse standing there with its entrails hanging out. Who's more majestic, heroic, the matador or the sacrificed horse? And then, of course, you do have the scene in which the matador is so bad that the crowd, holds him down and cuts his ponytail off. Right. So it's, you do get this sordid element in the bullfight scenes.
It's not. I don't think so. It's not sordid. And the way that you know that it's not sordid is that when you have that scene of the bad matador who has his ponytail cut off, he agrees with the treatment.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
He understands because he shares the expectations that his community has with him. I think from Hemingway's perspective, what that indicates is that unlike the world in which we live, that is unlike our time, there is a common culture and an established tradition, a meaning, a ritual, etc. here.
Yeah.
Now, you may well not find this beautiful or honorable. You might look at this and say, oh my God, what, this is just killing of animals and this treatment of horses, and what's so great about a matador killing bulls and allowing horses to die in this terrible way? All fair enough. I think from Hemingway's perspective, though, and it is, I would say, a deeply conservative, if not even a reactionary perspective, what you see in the bullfight is what's missing from our world. That is tradition, authority, honor.
Yeah. It also brings us back to the famous Hemingway word code.
Right.
These people have a code. The failed matador, the bad matador, understands the code, and he subscribes to it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. One way you can get a sense of this in a bigger context is to look at the design of the chapters in the book as a whole. So I'll show my students something like this, and I'll ask them, what do they think the order of these stories implies? Is there a design here? Is there something beyond randomness in the way these stories are put together? I think so. So I will ask my students about this, and what they will arrive at eventually, or what I will hope that they arrive at, is that the bullfighting is the center of the book. And right at the middle of this collection, there's this series of 5 vignettes of bullfighting in which bullfighting is suggested to be exemplary of a traditional culture, a culture that is coherent and ritualized and honorable and traditional. But it's surrounded by different kinds of violence. It's surrounded by scenes of crime and ultimately by scenes of war and revolution. In other words, I think the suggestion here is it's a little bit like the famous Kafka line, where Kafka says in a letter to his beloved, "There is hope, but not for us." I think similarly for Hemingway, there is tradition and honor, but not for us. It's in Spain. It is not for the citizens of the United States and the inhabitants of the modern world. We can look back with nostalgia on a world that has disappeared to us, but we live in the world of war and revolution.
Well, we have another participant has noted another motif here. When she compares the cries, the screams of the women to that of the bullring crowd.
Right.
And are they cries of triumph, she asks, or shouts for a quick death?
Well, again, I'm going to say, I'm going to give you what I think is Hemingway's sense here, and again say that I don't mean in making this comment to endorse this or to suggest that it's a view that we should necessarily share, but I don't think that Hemingway wants to give us in the bullfight something like what you might see in a scene of the Roman Colosseum. He doesn't want to show us popular viciousness, squalor, brutality. What he wants to show us is indeed a contrast to what you see on the road to Karagach. Is if you look at the modern world for Hemingway, I think what you see is a world where women suffer and are abused and give childbirth or suffer childbirth out in the open, where sex is debased, where commerce runs rampant, where violence is common, where brutality is ordinary, where honor has absconded. And in that context, the bullfight looks exceptional. It looks rare. It looks a little bit like Dr. Adams in the way that Nick wanted to remember him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would just say, to go back to the death of the Indian in Indian camp, students will say, why does he kill himself? And Dr. Adams has a good explanation. He can't stand it. The Indian knows what it means to live in the modern world. It means to live in a world where a white doctor gets to enter your home, where you suffer dishonor, where you see your women humiliated and in pain. Mm-hmm. And rather than live in that world, he prefers to die.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question here. Would you say the bullfighting in Spain scenes are the anchor to in our time?
Yeah, that's exactly what I would say. Yeah, an anchor and a counterpoint. The pathos of the book depends on our sense that that's not our world. It's the world that we've lost. It's gone away. And one way we can see this as an implication of the book, by the way, is by thinking about the difference between the bullfighting scenes and the more conventional stories that surround them. So interspersed with the bullfighting scenes are stories like The Revolutionist, Mr. and Mrs. Elliot, Cat in the Rain, Out of Season, Cross Country Snow, Mild Man. And what do these stories have in common? I will ask my students, and the obvious answer is they're stories of expatriates. As if the bullfighting scenes give us a vision of traditional and coherent culture where people share understandings, what you get in Cat in the Rain or Out of Season are people who are out of season. Think about Out of Season and the encounter between Peduzzi and the unnamed couple in that story. You have misunderstandings across multiple languages in a scene of criminality and corruption and selfishness. It is, again, in a smaller way than what you get with Drevitz and Boyle, but in a way that Hemingway, I think, expects us to see as resonant, squalid. So we are not having in these stories what we get in the bullfight.
So we have one question about the humiliated bullfighter. He is shamed. That's right. Yeah. So we're supposed to sympathize with the fact that he is in shame.
Right. You can't shame Boyle. Jimmy Boyle, the violent cop in Chicago, cannot be shamed by the explanation that he has shot somebody whose innocence or guilt he's uninterested in. You can shame a bad bullfighter. That's a shorthand way, I think, for Hemingway of pointing to the difference between a traditional world and a modern world. In a culture of honor, shame is the result of bad behavior. In a culture that doesn't have honor, a true conservative might say, shame has no force, has no power.
We have a question here about Nick and honor. When you say that honor has absconded from the modern world, do you think the character Nick is to be seen as without honor when he makes the joke, quote unquote, to Rinaldi about not being patriots in chapter 6? Is it sarcasm toward Nick or the cultural validation of pro patria mori?
Oh, it's not the cultural validation of pro patria mori, I don't think at all. I think the suggestion is that Nick is an honorable man in a dishonorable world. Now, he's a little bit like his contemporary, the hard-boiled detective. There's a lot of pathos in that story for Hemingway's contemporaries, and it's a kind of enduring pathos. That is, the implicit subject of this book is one that has a lot of resonance for many readers to this day. How do you live as a decent person in an indecent world? Your response is, for Hemingway, I think, provisional, uncertain, and not always honorable. It also requires, ultimately, for Nick Adams, something that isn't required for the people in the bullfight scenes: isolation. How do you live in a dishonorable world if you're an honorable person? I think Hemingway's suggestion is you have to go out over the burned out territory and go up into the Upper Peninsula and be by yourself with the fish. Somebody asked, how do we know that Hemingway is not just a misogynist who prefers nature because he doesn't like other people? And I would say that's exactly right. That is exactly Nick Adams's case. If you're Nick Adams, you distrust other people because they are representatives of a world of dishonor and corruption. So what can you do with that but get out? Now, if that's the case, one way to emphasize that is to think about a story that's often passed over in the book, but that I think is personally for me very resonant, which is The Revolutionist, one of the series of stories about people out of place. And so one thing I'll ask my students is, how does that character in The Revolutionist compare to Dick Adams? And they will very quickly say, oh, yes, they have a lot in common. They're young people who travel through the world. They travel on trains. They're away from their homes. They encounter the brutality of the modern world, but they're quite different. So the Revolutionist is a naif. He is a young person who suffers from the cruelty of others, but wishes not to acknowledge it, I think, from Hemingway's perspective. He is in Italy in 1922. The fascists are about to take power in Italy as the the extreme right has just taken power in Hungary. One of the consequences of World War I is political violence, of course, some of which is evident in the creation of the Soviet Union, but much more prominently in the world that Hemingway describes in the rise of right-wing extremist movements. The revolutionist is a person who encounters this but does not want to deal with it, basically. And how do we know this? Well, one way we know is the paintings that he likes. He likes Piero della Francesca, who you see on the left. Mantegna, he does not like. I think for Hemingway, that difference speaks volumes. Is what the revolutionist, the person who represents a kind of left-wing naivete from Hemingway's perspective, what he doesn't want to deal with is the death of piety. What he doesn't want to deal with is the scene of the dead corpse of a truly mortal Christ, a mortal Christ whose phallus is right at the center of this canvas. That is, a Christ who looks very much like a human being who once lived and who is now dead. In the Piero painting to the left, you'll see that there is a scene of the flogging of a living Christ, which is entirely idolized without a representation of suffering. That's Hemingway's way of saying to us, talking to us, I think, about the difference between an idealized reaction to the modern world and the one that he prefers, a disenchanted one. Another way to put this would be to say that what you see in the Piero della Francesca painting, is something like what Hemingway sees in Christian Science, in The Doctor's Wife, in The Doctor and the Doctor's Wife, or what you see in Mr. and Mrs. Eliot, willful naivete, a refusal to contend with the ugliness and brutality of the world that you live in. So the implication of the book more generally is admirable people contend with the ugliness of their world by responding realistically and ultimately heroically. They go fishing. So you go fishing, and one person asked, well, how do we know that Hemingway is not just a misogynist? And I would say, I don't think we know that he's not. I think we actually have a good sense that he is a real misogynist, but maybe not always in the ways that we would expect. So one thing that I will show to my students in order to emphasize the power of implication in his writing is an example of one scene, which to me is not especially important, but typical, representative of the way that Hemingway's writing works. So here's a scene from Cat in the Rain. And I will ask my students, what do you see in this story? And they will say, okay, they're young Americans who are expatriates, they're tourists, they're isolated, they're out of place, they're unhappy, they're stuck with each other in the scene of isolation. It's miserable. And I will ask them to take a look at the scene. She went over and sat in front of the mirror of the dressing table, looking at herself with the hand glass. She studied her profile, first one side and then the other. Then she studied the back of her neck. Don't you think it would be a good idea if I let my hair grow out? She asked, looking at her profile again. George looked up and saw the back of her neck, clipped close like a boy's. I like it the way it is. I get so tired of it, she said. I get so tired of looking like a boy. George shifted his position in the bed. He hadn't looked away since she started to speak. You look pretty darn nice, he said. She laid the mirror down in the dresser and went over to the window and looked out. It was getting dark. I want to pull my hair back tight and smooth and make a big knot at the back that I can feel, she said, and I want to have a kitty to sit on my lap and purr when I stroke her, and I want to eat at a table with my own silver, and I want candles, and I want it to be spring. Oh, shut up and get something to read, George said. He was reading again. So I'll read this passage with my students, and I'll say, what do we know about the marriage of these people from this scene? And of course, students will say, well, look, it's a bad marriage. These people don't get along. George finds his wife annoying. And I say, yes, that all seems right to me, but what do you know about George from the line at the center of this passage where we're told George shifted his position in the bed. He hadn't looked away since she started to speak. So we're running short on time, so let me make a suggestion about what I think we might see here. And you can contest if you think it's not convincing, as people often do not. I think what we know from this, George shifted his position in the bed. He hadn't looked away since she started to speak. I think we know from this that he finds his wife attractive. If he was merely bored or annoyed by his wife, he wouldn't be looking at her. But the fact that he hasn't looked away since she started to speak tells us, I think, that he loves his wife. He loves his wife, and what he's annoyed by is not her in general, but by what she wants. What does she want? She wants to pull her hair back and smooth and make a big knot at the back that I can feel. She wants to have a kitty sit in her lap. She wants to eat at a table with her own silver and candles. So I've asked my students, what does this mean? What does she want? And what my students will quickly realize, I think, is fairly evident. She wants to settle down. She wants to have a family. She wants, in other words, to look like the people that we see in the photograph of the young Hemingway's family. She wants to be a Victorian. She wants probably a child. And what George does not like is what Nick probably doesn't like in cross-country snow, and what's hinted at throughout the book in the many images of ugly childbirth that we see in this book. He doesn't want to be a father. He doesn't want to become somebody like Harold Krebs's father. He doesn't want to grow up. Why? Well, maybe it's because it's more fun to ski and drink and live in Europe. But I think from Hemingway's perspective, the more compelling answer would be because growing up and getting married and making children means joining the world of complication, as Harold Krebs describes it. It means becoming complicit. It means joining a civilization that is corrupted. One thing you can note about the book is the way the marriage of George and his wife, the woman who looks like a boy, is typical of many relationships in the book. You might think about Ad Reinhardt and his manager slash sister slash wife in that one story. You could think about Harold Krebs and his sister. You could think about Luz and the unnamed protagonist of A Very Short Story. There's lots of stories in this collection about relationships that look innocent and that look fraternal, that look like relationships of brothers and sisters, that look pre-adult, that look not married, that are not bourgeois, in other words.
We have a really good comment here, Sean, about this very point. When I read scenes like this in Hemingway, I also think of Hills Like White Elephants. It shows me that Hemingway's misogyny is mostly part of his persona. To be a true misogynist, you have to deny the humanity of a woman to a certain extent, to objectify her. Instead, we are struck by the man's callousness and the woman's humanity. The woman wants to fulfill her responsibilities, but like men after World War I, she finds that she no longer has a clear role. Is she a boy or girl? I don't think it's about her wanting a family. I think it's about confusion of gender roles. And I think it's an interesting comment. To be a misogynist, you have to deny a woman's humanity. And Hemingway, he really doesn't do that.
Yeah, that seems right to me. I mean, his characters find women endlessly disappointing and annoying, but not because they don't love them. To me, it is misogynist. Women are there to be loved and ideally to be good partners, but they're always letting you down if you're a Hemingway protagonist. They're like Luce in A Very Short Story, where there has been this boy and girl affair, as the narrator tells us, but it doesn't last because Luce throws over the protagonist for the Italian officer who never marries her. And then you might remember that the protagonist catches gonorrhea from a salesgirl in the Loop in a taxi traveling through a park in Chicago. So to me, that's Hemingway's view of all of the problems of the modern world, is women who can't be relied on, a modern commercial society, corruption, cheap sex, unhappiness. I think that what George wants is like what Nick Adams wants, to be away from that. And the pathos of the book is that you can't be away from it unless you go fishing by yourself, unless you travel out over the burned out country. That is, unless you go past the world of modern destruction into a world where you're alone with fish. And that may look juvenile from our perspective, but I think from Hemingway's perspective, as for many of his contemporaries, there's great pathos in that story, that you have to be alone. out in the natural world to get away from the world of modern corruption. Here's the world you want to go to, and here's a situation you want to be in, where you might remember, by the way, the fish, they're all male fish. It's a purely male world in the end. As a final note, I guess I would just want to say that one thing I like to suggest to my students is there's a big design here in this book, that there are two big major themes that are developed through the two storylines of the book, and they're stories about about contending with a corrupted and disenchanted world. It is a book that is both artistically innovative and culturally conservative in the extreme. And from my experience, that is a good problem for my students to wrestle with. So thank you very much for talking with me, and I would be happy to respond to any other questions or comments.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our time here. Let me repeat Sean's question. Do you have any last questions or comments? Sean, I think you're getting a bit of a fan club here. We've had a number of people who want to have a In Our Time 2 seminar to pick up Big Two-Hearted River. Let me just tell our participants that we don't have an In Our Time 2 seminar scheduled with Sean, but we do have on March 5th, teaching The Great Gatsby. So if you enjoyed tonight's seminar, please enroll in the seminar for March 5th, when we'll be looking at Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I don't see any comments or questions. I see some comments, but no questions coming over the transom. So let me tell you that we will be monitoring the form through January 11th. That means that if questions and comments come in, we'll pass them on to Sean, and we'll get back in touch with you. Sean, I want to thank you for giving us a really excellent seminar. It's one of the best we've done. I learned a great deal, and from the comments and questions of our participants, I think they did too. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
And I want to thank our participants. You guys really made this a great seminar tonight. Lots of good comments and questions. So, before we sign off, let me remind you to check our spring schedule at americainclass.org. There you will see not only Sean's seminar, but many others that we hope you'll sign up for. I want to thank you again for your participation, and please remember to submit your evaluations. And keep in mind, they're newly shortened, so they won't be quite the ordeal that you went through before. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll be with us again soon. Thank you very much, and good evening.